So, what got you started into journalism? What first got you interested or excited about doing journalism?
I loved newspapers from a really early age. I used to read the Nashville Banner when it would come to our home every afternoon, and from the age of 6 or 7, I was fascinated by the news, and I really can't explain that. I don't know where that came from, but I was a regular newspaper reader all the way through my youth, and I got interested in writing when I was in sort of junior school, and joined the staff of the newspaper at Montgomery Bell Academy in 9th grade. Writing sports mostly for all the way through my high school years, but I ended up editing that paper as a senior, and went on to Vanderbilt, which doesn't have a journalism program, but did have a sort of journalism fraternity unofficially. All the student publications were in Surratt Tunnel underneath one of the main buildings, and the publications tended to attract non-frat boy types like me, and so my closest friends in college were at the radio station, the newspaper, a couple different magazines that were there, and so forth. And I threw myself into all of that. And when I got out, had a double major in English and classics, which I thought might get me a job as a poet, but didn't. I really had no idea what I was going to do when I got out. And I went to work as a paralegal for a local law firm, doing business law mainly, and that was and remains a really valuable experience. I just spent 15 months there, but I learned all about public records, where to find what kind of information in researching the defense to a lawsuit, or the securities offering, or whatever else was going on. I had to know my way around the courthouse, the various court clerks' offices, and various other areas where you would access public records. All of that, of course, at the time in the 80s, was on paper, and or on microfilm or microfiche, and I had to learn to gather that information by shoe leather, and I began to write for free for various little music magazines, and I think in '87, when I was a year out of college, I got my first freelance assignment for the Nashville Business Journal. Interestingly, it paid, as I recall, $150 for a feature-length article, and I would bet you that today that's about what they pay for a feature-length article. The cost, the value of freelance labor has gone way down over the years. The value of journalistic labor in general really has gone down with all the pressures the industry's been under. So I freelanced for them. I got a marketing job with a company that helped banks market their services. And the owner, or the CEO of that company, was an entrepreneur named Bill King, who had a lot of different things going on, including he had some ideas about media properties he wanted to create. So he sort of plucked me out of there and made me the founding editor of a magazine called Bank Director in 1990. And that was a great experience. That, as the name implies, that was for board members of banks. And so I was already moving in a direction of mainly doing business journalism at that point. And I got into the very specialized field of writing about banks. And that magazine is still around today and has been very successful. So. You want me to take it on through from there, everything I've done? Or?
Yeah, sure. I guess just go ahead and go into how you got working with the Post or the Scene. Or...
Sure. Well, the Scene was what's known as a shopper. It was a little, very fluffy weekly publication that was thrown in people's driveways in zip codes that were considered to be affluent. I think it was started in the early 80s by some people. So it was not known as a publication with any real journalistic credibility, and didn't try to be. And in the mid to late 80s, there was a rise of alternative weekly papers springing up around the country. There had for a very long time, they'd been the Village Voice and the Chicago Reader, the LA Weekly. They had been around a while. But papers modeled on them started showing up in cities the size of Nashville. And I had a notion of trying to get one started here in the late 80s. It did start, actually, with some friends. Not a journalistic publication really at all, but sort of a music fanzine about the local music scene here called the Fireplace Whiskey Journal. And that only lasted a few months, but it caught the attention of some people who were trying to get a serious alt weekly off the ground here, and that was Bruce Doby and Albie Del Favreau. They ended up buying the Nashville Scene, just buying its name and assets and turning it into an alt weekly. That happened in summer of '89. So I was writing for them as a freelancer in some of their earliest issues, and I stayed involved with them, wrote occasional cover stories and other stories for them, but I was working full time, so I never went full time on staff there. A lot of the people who were there in the early years are still good friends of mine. And the current editor, Jim Ridley, who was their first full-time employee, I go back to Vanderbilt days with him. He was one of the people in Surratt Tunnel back at Vanderbilt. Let's see. So I was working full-time for the magazine, writing for the Scene on the side, and I left. I put all of that aside in '93 to do a biography of a man named Jan Karski, who had brought some of the first news of the Holocaust out of Poland during the war. So I got out of local journalism for a year and a half or so, working on that. Not less than that, really, because it was really just for '93. And at the end of '93, I joined the staff of the Tennessean. The Tennessean at the time had been under the control of Gannett for 13 years. And for most of that time, John Siegenthaler had remained in place as the editor and publisher there. His legendary influence kept Gannett from doing too much to meddle with the content of the paper. That was all changing as I got there. So there was a tension between people who wanted to uphold the values of the Siegenthaler era when the paper had done some really great things. Although I will say by the 80s it was not doing much in the way of great things. And people who were brought in from Gannett, who were journeymen, Gannett executives and so on, brought in to start to make it look more like the rest of the Gannett papers and look more like USA Today. So I came in inadvertently, stumbled right into that whole tension. The editor at the time was Frank Sutherland, who had been had come up under Siegenthaler and had done really fine investigative work for him on a staff that in the early 70s included Al Gore and Jerry Thompson. They were doing undercover investigations of the Ku Klux Klan and conditions at the local mental hospital, which were horrific, and they did a lot of great work. Gore was very talented as a journalist, actually, and got a number of scalps. Got people arrested, councilmen arrested in the council chambers because of his reporting, things like that. So Frank was trying to uphold those values while still doing the bidding of his Gannett masters. And I had a very productive couple of years on staff at the Tennessean, but it was also a pretty unhappy couple of years. I did, for my very first story there, this was not how things were planned, but I went to Frank in my first week there, and I said, I've learned some things about a guy in town named Richard Osias, who portrays himself as sort of the leader of the Nashville moral majority type people. He was launching campaigns against radio stations that were doing risque things on the air, and he was, making himself known as a sort of moralist. And I discovered one thing that didn't make a lot of sense, and then another, and I finally peeled back the layers and discovered that he had defrauded his own parents out of $100 million, set them adrift on a yacht, telling them that they had to flee the U.S. to avoid being arrested on some kind of tax charges. So his father was on this boat dying of kidney disease while he kept them away from all the rest of his family. It was a wild, weird story. And it ran him out of town. He had built the house down Hillsborough Road here that has the huge fleur-de-lis fountain in front of it, and at the time, biggest house in Nashville. He spent about $5 million on it and sold it for about $2 million. And the paper let me, Sutherland got very engaged in that story, and essentially let me take 6 months doing almost nothing else. Hired a stringer in Monaco because part of the story played out in Monaco. Sent me to Florida and to Georgia to go through various public records, and spent a huge amount on lawyers because this guy hired the former state attorney general to try to sue me. So that was the first time I ever had the experience of very carefully lawyering a story to make it litigation proof. That was a valuable experience that I've repeated any number of times since then with various other publications. So that story ran in May of '94, I guess. And I had a couple of other good investigative pieces while I was there, and I did a lot of business writing. I was on the business desk officially, although they would cut me loose for these investigative pieces. I eventually ran headlong into a conflict between my values and the Gannett values. They wanted stories to be short and sweet and not too in-depth and nothing to upset the advertisers too much. And so I decided in September '95 to go out on my own and just freelance. I had a contract with a guy who was trying to write a business book that never really materialized, but I spent a lot of time working with him. He was down in Memphis. And I was full-time freelance until '97. And during that time, I'd had some contact with the Wall Street Journal. I'd been offered a job, in fact, by the Wall Street Journal in New York that we decided not to take because my wife was at the Banner and was doing very well there as the food writer for the Banner. And that came up at about '95, I guess. And So out of that relationship, I ended up doing freelancing for the Journal, and somewhere around that time, I think while I was trying to leave the paper, I sent a stack of clips to the New York Times, and lo and behold, a year after I left, June of 90, well, not quite a year, but maybe 7 months after I left, in June of 96, I had a call one day, and it was the New York Times saying they liked the look of my clips and would like me to string for them down here. So I did a lot of work with them, and both of those were great experiences because you're working with the very best. If I needed some kind of obscure piece of research done in what were then very expensive news databases, like Dow Jones News Service, what's now Factiva, I could call a librarian in New York, and she would have me the goods in a matter of hours. And the copy editors I worked with were excellent. The editors were first rate, and so those were great experiences. I ended up I was in Atlanta the night the bombing happened at the Olympics in '96, and I ended up working for the Times at a hospital in the north of Atlanta, interviewing the sort of walking wounded who'd been triaged up there from 2 in the morning till 6 in the morning the night after that happened. So I had a lot of fun adventures with them. 97, after a teaching gig in Romania that lasted a few months, I came back and took over as editor and eventually publisher of Nashville Life magazine and Business Nashville magazine, which were owned by Eagle Communications. I became president of that company, and they were in a crisis when I joined up, and it was a turnaround situation, and I did my best to turn them around both editorially and on the business side. Did get Business Nashville turned around. We eventually had to shut down Nashville Life, and Business Nashville eventually sold out to Nashville Post and became Nashville Post magazine, which is still published today. During that time, I covered the implosion of Columbia HCA, the federal raids on their hospital campuses and so forth in the spring of '97 that led to the firing of Rick Scott, their charismatic CEO, who's now governor of Florida. And let's see. I guess after that, I went to spent a year with a language education company. So basically out of daily journalism for a little while, and I spent another year on a book with John Edgerton called Nashville: An American Self-Portrait. And that was, in a sense, a journalism gig. It was, we got venture funding and went out and rounded up about 40 different authors and a huge number of photographers to try to chronicle the city in 1 year. And the year we chose turned out pretty good because it was 2000. It began with the Titans in the Super Bowl, and it ended with Bush v. Gore. So I'm still pretty happy with the way that book came out, and a lot of prominent journalists were involved with it. Some from out of town who had been here back in the 60s and so forth, like David Halberstam, were involved. Roy Blunt Jr. and Lamar Alexander, a number of people. That project, my partner on that was John Edgerton, who you probably will want to talk to if you can. He's sort of the dean of Nashville journalists, I'd say. He's been more of an author than a journalist over the years, but but he has done a lot of local journalism. And that's spelled Egerton. My family and I moved to England in 2001 to do some academic work, and came back at the very end of 2003. And I freelanced for a while. And in 2000, I was close friends with the guys who had founded Nashville Post. It was David A. Fox, and Bill Carey. We had been on the business desk together at the Tennessean. David had been a few years ahead of me at MBA, and was in my brother's class there. And Bill and I were at Vanderbilt together, so we went way back. The venture capitalist who helped launch Nashville Post in 2000, at the end of '99, really, was Towns Duncan, who also backed, at about the same time, was backing our book about Nashville. And so I was unofficially involved in the launch of the Post. I was around and took part in some meetings and things like that as they were trying to figure out what to do, how best to get it off the ground, whether they needed a print component to it or not. It was right at the moment, really, of the .com bust that they actually launched, and so they put a lot of energy into trying to get a much better business reporting product out there than the Tennessean, and they beat them pretty badly and regularly. And so I followed that from abroad and so on. And in 2005, the Post had a crisis of sorts, a split between the guy who was running their magazine and David Fox, who was running the online product. Even though he was one of the founders, Bill Carey had already left, and the magazine guy, basically, David decided to quit. And so they ceased publication in the online product, NashvillePost.com, ceased publication in August of 2005. And then there was a great groundswell of people contacting Towns and, in the business community saying, how can you let this happen? We really love this thing, and we'll subscribe if you'll bring it back. So he got David Fox, who had gone on to a hedge fund, his brother's hedge fund firm, but just working on the side. He got Towns got David to round up a new team to relaunch Nashville Post in December, officially, I guess, December of 2005. And that was Richard Lawson, who had just broken the news he was a Tennessean business reporter who had just broken news that Nissan's headquarters was coming to Nashville. So he was riding a big scoop, but was very unhappy at the Tennessean. So he came. Ken Whitehouse, who had been a political operative, Democratic political operative, worked with Al Gore and Ned McWhorter down through the years. He became our political reporter, and I took on a lot of different roles there in terms of editing the copy and writing stories. So we set to work in December of 2005 and remade the Post. Had to redo its technical, its website and its content management system and everything from scratch, really. We were not making money, but we were getting better. The numbers were continually going in the right direction, so Towns kept funding it. Here I'm fuzzy on the dates. I believe it was late 2007 when Towns decided to consolidate his various media properties. By that point, he had invested in Music Row magazine and I forget what else, but he brought in Chris Farrell, former councilman. Chris was a councilman at large at age 25, the youngest in Nashville history. And Chris became CEO of a company now to be called Southcom. And as time went by in the next couple of years, Southcom bought, I'm trying to remember the sequence of events, but soon it bought the City Paper, which had been founded in 2000 by a guy named Brian Brown. He had lost a lot of money on it. The family, the Thompson family of Thompson Machinery had bought it from him, and they were losing a lot of money on it. And so Southcom bought it, turned it from daily to weekly publication, and began to reshape it into the form it has today. Then, some months after that, the Nashville Scene came on the market. The Scene, Bruce Doby and Ali Del Favreau had sold. They had bought out their investors in the Scene during the 90s, and then sold the paper to Village Voice Media. Village Voice Media had managed to destroy a lot of the value of the Scene. They were almost as bad a chain as Gannett, and they got into a situation where they were desperate to sell it. So my understanding is that Southcom got it for a pretty good price. And so now we had the Scene, the City Paper, and Nashville Post, and Music Row, and a few other media properties, all under Southcom. And I played various roles at Southcom in the next few years. At the beginning of 2011, I had an opportunity to go to work on another book project that is about the healthcare industry, so it has a lot to do with Nashville, but I'm not in daily journalism anymore. I miss it, and I hope I'll get back to it at some point. But that's the story up to now.
All right. Having worked internationally some, how's like Nashville compare? What do you love about Nashville in relation to other areas?
Well, Nashville's my hometown. I feel very comfortable here. I feel like I know everybody who matters, or at least I'm trying to get to know everybody who matters. As a journalist, I place a lot of value. I think it's very important that you have journalists in a community who know the community well. The market doesn't actually pay a whole lot for that knowledge. I haven't gotten rich doing this, but it has been satisfying. I feel like it's a necessary thing in any community that you have some people who know it well enough to write about more than just what comes out in the press releases. The international work that I've done has spun out of the military history research that I did for my book back in '94 for the Karski biography. I have, when I was doing my international relations degree at Cambridge, I was working with a professor named Chris Andrew, who's the official historian of MI5, and took part in a seminar that he has that involves a lot of intelligence-related stuff. Basically, a seminar on the history of intelligence agencies, and so I developed an interest in that. Since I happened to arrive there in September 2001, I ended up adapting my thesis topic to something related to counterterrorism, and wrote about the police cooperation among European police agencies against the anarchist terrorists of the 1890s, which really gave birth to organizations like MI5, the first secret intelligence organizations. And in terms of journalism abroad, I have done a little reporting from Romania while I was there teaching. I did some string for the Times there. Done some from Poland. I didn't do very much. I did a couple stories while I was in the UK, but I was concentrated on my studies there. Certainly loved living in Cambridge. It's a beautiful place, expensive but beautiful, and wish we could have stayed longer.
And just, I guess, final question: advice you have for people in getting involved in journalism or breaking into that culture here in Nashville, particularly?
Well, we're in the midst of the most difficult time I've ever known in this industry. And part of me would want to tell any young person to run screaming and go find something much safer to do with your career. But ultimately, I feel that there has to be a function that resembles what we used to call journalism. If a democracy is going to function the way it needs to, and so the good old-fashioned shoe leather journalism, comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable, getting deep local knowledge and putting that to work as you report on your community. I think there's always going to be a need for that, and I'm holding out hope that that there will be a mechanism to make that a viable career path. I think I've been reading a lot of predictions lately about print publications. One I read today said that 2015 will be the year when we finally have a shutdown of a large number of print newspapers and magazines. Once you can deliver the news to a tablet or a smartphone, and once enough people have those, and the adoption rates are, climbing very rapidly, and you don't have all the expense of printing a newspaper, there's a huge commodity expense. My career was influenced at the Tennessean by the fact that the price of newsprint shot up during the time I was there. Some kind of shortage of trees in Canada to cut down and make newsprint. I don't know about that market, but I know that it heavily influenced how many pages we could run, and therefore how much news we could get out there. So when you get print out of the equation, the industry may, I hope it will, normalize, and media companies will be able to spend enough on content to attract people who are capable of giving them good content. So a younger person going into this business right now, there will be jobs right now because they don't have to pay you very much. The question becomes, will it be a career path you can hold down as you get older and have a family to support and all that? And I'm guardedly hopeful that in the post-print world, that'll be possible.